You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hi there, and welcome to the Campus Podcast with me, Miranda Prynne.
And with me, Eliza Compton.
So today we are tackling the complex and endlessly fascinating topic of cross-cultural communication, which is incredibly important within higher education for a number of reasons. First, the sector itself is very international. So you have students and staff often studying and working overseas, and the need to communicate effectively across these national and cultural divides is therefore vital at every level, really, within a university. But secondly, it occurs to me a broader point is that we live in this very and increasingly globalised world. We all know geographical borders really become quite meaningless in the face of digital communication. And we also, working on campus, we hear a lot about the need to equip students with skills that they may need for the as yet unknown jobs of the future. So this need to sort of future-proof students is something a lot of academics and universities are quite focused on. And it seems one key to that is improving their cross-cultural communication skills.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a key topic, isn't it, for so many reasons. I looked up some statistics actually about international students and discovered that in the UK in 2021 and 2022, there was nearly 680,000 and more than 1 million in the US. So we're talking about a very large cohort who are very much affected by these issues. And often when we talk about them, we focus on the economics, the visa policies, their impact on immigration figures. But actually, it was my own sort of interest in language learning, as well as working on campus and editing resources about teaching English as a second language, that really got me thinking about all the sorts of things that you've been talking about, Miranda, with regards to cross-cultural communication and what kind of advice would be useful. So I reached out to two academics with really different expertise and life experience in this space. One who is based in Europe and teaches in the highly practical area of medical communication. And the other is exploring language through creative writing and other mediums in the mountains of Central Asia.
Yeah, it's fantastic to be looking at this from two very different angles, as you say, one very creative and the other very functional. And it is, of course, you mentioned, teaching English as a second language, but as we know, it's really important to remember that communication goes far beyond sort of language knowledge, and languages are, after all, a product of the culture which they come from, and then they indeed kind of feed back into said culture. But that's something I think your first guest, Lucy Palmer herself, a writer, an editor, all-round communications expert, is interested in this interplay of language and communication and how different languages bring nuance to that.
Yes, absolutely. My first interview is with Lucy Palmer, who is a senior lecturer in communications and media based in the Naren campus of the University of Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. She is a former foreign correspondent, so based in Papua New Guinea for a while, and a successful memoir writer. And I was really keen to talk to her about making that transition into a very different culture, as well as what kind of techniques she used when teaching creative writing in a multilingual classroom. Hi, Lucy, and welcome to the THE podcast.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Can you tell us a bit about your location? Where are you actually in the world?
Well, it's funny, I actually had to do 7 zoom outs on my location, which is in the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan, before I recognized any other neighboring country that I'd even never heard of. So I'm in a country called Kyrgyzstan. It's one of the 5 Central Asian states, and which is all part of the old sort of Soviet empire. that kind of collapsed or became independent in the early 90s. And our university is about 5 hours from the nearest, well, from the capital city, about a 4 or 5 hour drive in a very, very remote location.
Incredible. I had a look on the map. Like you, I couldn't have identified it if you'd asked me cold. You are a senior lecturer in communications and media at the university, which is one clue about why I sought you out to have a chat today about our topic of cross-cultural communication. You have quite an international cohort, I believe. Can you tell me a bit about what you teach at the university and a bit about your students? So how far away do they come?
So our students are, I think under the legislation, we have to take a certain number of Kyrgyz students. I believe it's 60-70% perhaps. And our students come from neighboring Central Asian countries, primarily Tajikistan and Kazakhstan. But we also have students who come from Afghanistan, Syria, and we've even had a student from Kenya. So essentially, it is the three founding states of the University of Central Asia, which is Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan.
What is it specifically about your background that prepared you for this role at the University of Central Asia? And what about it appealed to you?
I think the first thing that appealed to me about it is it's completely different to anywhere else I've ever been. And in fact, before I was approached by a former colleague who I worked with at a university in Papua New Guinea, I had never even heard of Kyrgyzstan. And like a lot of people, it's a bit of an amorphous area in the world, and it just becomes the stands. So I knew very little about it. And I think what appealed to me about working here, I came originally as a visiting lecturer for 6 months, and then I was given the option to continue. I think that, like most people, I quite enjoy traveling, should I say. Not everybody enjoys traveling at all. But I like the idea of seeing and understanding life, society, human beings from different perspectives. And in Central Asia, it's a semi-nomadic culture, or it has been traditionally and still is in some ways. And so people have different values. They have different values to the values that I'm used to. And so I really enjoy that sense of learning about my own, not only about their culture, but then in a sense about my own. So, for example, through living here, I can also then turn that lens of what's important to people living here back on my own societies, whether that's Australia or Britain. And I can see the differences, and I can work out for myself then what I think really has value for me, because we all grow up to be conditioned about the societies we live in. And it's only really from stepping outside those societies that we kind of see those societies from a different perspective.
That's part of the richness of the international classroom, I think, isn't it? So the theme of today's episode is going to be cross-cultural communication and teaching in the international classroom. And I wondered whether, for you, having a class that includes students from different cultures had an influence on your teaching style or the way that you communicate with your students, particularly given that you teach in communications and media.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, who's teaching who? That's a great question that I come to this university space with, because it's so important for me to go in with a sense of humility, that the students are also here to teach me, and I'm also here to learn from them and they from me. And in that way, to me, it is a very kind of respectful exchange of concepts. I think too, we as international lecturers, wherever we come from, but particularly those of us who come from the more developed world, it's a very hard concept to break in yourself, that you have all the answers and you're here to teach something superior or something beneficial. And I think that my teaching practice has changed very, very slowly. I think at the beginning I came in, there's the curriculum, this is what you're going to learn. and I'm trying to sort of, I suppose not stuff ideas into people, but I suppose provoke some kind of response, because ultimately what I want them to do is to engage with the material and then be able to integrate that material into their own philosophies, their own ways of writing, their own ways of seeing. And so, for example, one of the poems that I've used quite often as an opening kind of conversation in my creative writing classes is a Seamus Heaney poem called Digging. And it's really about, his ancestors digging potatoes, being in Ireland, the skill of the farmers, the skill of people who work with the land. And this is very much a land-based culture. And it is not so much about agriculture, but also about animals and feeding animals. And so this idea that my students who are living in this digital age, but they have come from families who were farmers and their grandparents were farmers. So it's amazing to see the instant link that they make with Seamus Heaney's poem. I think my teaching style has become much, much more open. I'm really very interested in the way that my students use language, the way that they understand English language. What does the term digging, as the title of that poem, what does that evoke for them? What do they think about? What do they feel when they encounter this kind of language, which is, I suppose, ancient concepts expressed in English? And I guess we're talking about, once again, even for Seamus Heaney, he is speaking in the language of the colonizer. And for my students who are speaking or writing or thinking or expressing in either Russian or English, there is this concept that, we are in sort of, that there has been language imposed on them, and which somehow suppresses or sort of pushes out the languages that they have grown up with, their mother tongues. But one other very interesting aspect, we said we'd never talk about politics, but we'll skirt into this concept.
Yes, in our pre-podcast chat.
Yeah, but I think this is a political point, which is that the languages, whether they be Tajik or Kazakh or Russian, they come with a certain amount of cultural baggage. So, for example, I really encourage my students, and this is how my teaching changed, to write in their native tongue.
Right.
If they want to write in Shugni, which is a language from the Pamiri region of Tajikistan, if they want to write in Kyrgyz or even Russian, Kazakh. But one of the things that sort of was really quite surprising to me was that a lot of my students said, no, we actually prefer to write in English because English comes with no cultural baggage and we feel a sense of freedom. And there are certain things that you would never express that are sort of would be deemed taboo to discuss. Relationships, privacy, sexuality. There are certain things that you do not discuss in your native tongue, whereas for a lot of my students, what they find in English is a freedom and a vocabulary that can allow them to explore their identity in a much more robust and expansive way, in ways that they simply wouldn't. And I thought, oh, wouldn't this be interesting to do this? And then I said, okay, write in your native language. Most of them found it very, very difficult. And then, of course, I'm asking them to translate. And they're saying, we actually can't translate. There is no concept. There is no word for this in the native languages that we're familiar with.
Yeah, there is definitely an emotional distance that comes with speaking in a second language. I wanted to ask you about assessment and outputs, and whether or not the language landscape that you've described, the cultural landscape, whether or not that also feeds into assessment and the types of outputs that you encourage from your students.
Well, I think one of the things that we are looking at in our university, and probably in many other universities, is the use of a multi media approach. And so when we talk about creative writing, yes, we're talking about text, but text that can be expressed on the page, can be expressed in the form of audio work, can be expressed in the form of video work. So I think that's one thing I want to say, that, we're living in a very digital age, and everything is driven by the digital economy, particularly for media and communication students. So I think that really encouraging students to experiment with the idea of simply not creative writing and then the words stay on the page. Okay, now what? Now what do we want to do with them? Do we want to break them up? Do we want to put them into some kind of art form? Do we want to look at audio representations? And how do the students want to respond to that? So for me, there's a huge amount. I want them to experience an enormous amount of freedom in doing so. So one of the things that I've done recently, and I'm coming to the UK later this year to talk at a creative writing conference in London. And one of the things that I've done is to focus on the concept of a river, or the cultural, spiritual, physical significance of rivers in Central Asia, where it barely ever rains. So rivers are life, and they are everything. And for the last 5 years, I've been taking my students down to the local river and then saying, well, here's a pen and paper, and off you go. The pen and paper is a bit of a throwback, but with ChatGPT, I find that it is absolutely vital to give them work that it is actually an embodied, in the moment work, rather than giving them assignments that they go off and then ask ChatGPT to write them a poem about rivers.
Interesting.
And so I have actually collated all the best, well, what I think are all the best lines from the poems that have been written over the last 5 years about the river. And I've now written a film script, which is also being translated into Kyrgyz. And I've given 3 of my students the task of creating a visual response to this poem. And which is really, I don't really know how to describe what this kind of poem is. It's a sort of collective poem written by probably 15 people and edited together by me for the sake of continuity and expression, and for the analysis that you go into when you look at a poem, that it's all in order and it all sort of makes sense. And this is one of the things that I really love about the students. I mean, I won't be telling them what to do. One of them's writing, one of them is translating, one of them is looking at the imagery, another one is providing animation, which is actually in response to their own drawings. So they're going to respond in drawing to my poem, and then that animation will be used as part of this film. So for me, it's really about trying to be as using the minimal amount of direction. Let them do something which we call in our university or in our department digital experiments. Here's a piece of work, here's a piece of literary work, or here's a piece of a novel written by a Kyrgyz writer, written by an Uzbek writer. What is your response to this? And how do you want to respond to it with your own response? And how would you like that response to be curated? Do you want to make a film about it? How do you want to do it? And in terms of assessments, I would go back to the dreaded ChatGPT. I do kind of live assessments. So we go to the river, write your poem in the moment, and then come back to the classroom and I'll record it. And that is your assignment. And so there is no potential for interference with any other platform that is coming in to try and sort of perhaps create better English, because of course my students are always thinking, oh, my English isn't very good, and maybe I'm not going to be very good at it. But what I actually love about working with these students, and with students that I work with in Papua New Guinea, and for very similar reasons, they are not native speakers, so they will do things with language that I would never dream of doing. And some of the work that I find, it's so thrilling for me as a writer, because I would instinctively know because of my education, conditioning, and so on, that, oh, you can't do that with you can't do that with words. But in fact, my students do that with words, and it works. It works in ways that are so unexpected and exciting. And for them, it's so lovely to hear that what they're doing with English is exciting to me, because I think they go into that classroom as students for whom English is their third or fourth language, and they always feel that they're not going to come up to par, that it's, that I'm going to be disappointed in their work because it's not perfect English. Whereas what I find is what they do with language is just absolutely thrilling to me as a writer. And so for me, there's a lot of celebration. But I think, for me, I also, when you talk about assessments, I just want to protect the spontaneity, the improvisation that they can produce in the moment, and assess that.
That's so interesting. And absolutely, apprehension about language ability in a way, adds another layer to class participation, but also to how students interact with assessment. You mentioned digital experimentation, and also the fact that you're in a very remote location. How has your location and access to technology, so things like Wi-Fi coverage, for example, how does that shape the content and format of the content of your classes and what you teach?
Well, we're actually very fortunate here. Our Wi-Fi coverage is so much better. But just going back in a little bit in time, when we had to close the university during COVID, a lot of our students went back to their homes in Central Asia, all over Central Asia. And that was a very challenging period, because they didn't get access. They don't have good access to Wi-Fi coverage. And so I think that was an enormous challenge. Just talking about where we are physically, we're about 2,200 meters up in the Tian Shan Mountains. We're next door to the town of Narin, which is probably the region is probably a population of 30 to 40,000 people. And it's a very interesting university. It's a residential university, which in so many ways we are very dependent upon one another. And so I think that the way that students here then interact with their surroundings, which don't offer the normal recreational facilities that university students are used to, bars, cafes, cinemas, traffic, it's the world of the city that the universities, most universities are contained in. When you're doing research projects that are deep into the roots of a very rural community, in which the values of that community are probably quite different to the values of the city life, or to the normative conditions of city life, I think this offers a really amazing prospect for students. We have students making films about nomads. What is the life of a nomad? How does that impact their philosophy? How does that impact the way they see the world and think and behave? And of course, with climate change now, the nomadic life is now becoming harder and harder, simply because there isn't enough access to pasture, to food. And so this whole region, like every region in the world, is having to adapt and accommodate to climate change. So, we're watching a way of life that's changing, dying, revitalizing. And just going back to this idea of digital experiments, many of the traditions in Kyrgyzstan are like many traditions in many countries where there has been that sort of rapid change, technological change. But then, in a sense, it also produces new ways of doing things. So you might have a game that's played traditionally here with the bones of a sheep. It's like jacks. We would sort of call them jacks in the UK or Australia. And so now our students are looking at those games, looking into the sort of deep history of those games, but then thinking, well, maybe we could recreate this game in a digital form. Maybe this is a way that we keep this going. So it's very dynamic. Having said that, that's the conversation we're here to have about what makes sense to us all and who we are as people and how we live. And I think that's the richness that going somewhere new and completely unfamiliar provides.
How fascinating to absorb all that going on around you. I want to ask you one more final question. Academia is well known for its peripatetic lifestyle. Academics move from country to country as a matter of course. I think it's an accepted part of many academic careers. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who has moved countries several times, whether you have any advice for academics moving countries about settling into a culture that is perhaps significantly different from their own.
Well, I would say don't expect to say you really know anything about it until you've been there at least 2 years. Because there are layers and there are layers and there are layers and there are layers. And I guess my advice, for what it's worth, would be embrace it. It's an incredible opportunity. I mean, we talk a lot about critical thinking in academia. But what we're often talking about is critical thinking within the paradigm that we're used to. So what are the limits to which we can go in the knowledge base and the knowledge form that we're already familiar with? And I think going to a completely different culture in which those norms simply don't necessarily exist, or they exist in another form, is a great way to expand your capacity for critical thinking.
Well, thank you so much for this window that you've given us into your work at the University of Central Asia. I'm very grateful for your time today, Lucy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
There is so much rich food for thought there for anyone teaching multilingual student groups. But I particularly love what Lucy says about how working in non-native languages can actually set students free of the learnt rules or bounds of linguistic conventions and enable them to do really unique and interesting things with the way that they use the language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really loved hearing about the setting of where she was teaching, so such as the river, and how that fed really deeply into her work. And also how the experience itself had changed the way that she saw the possibilities of language. There's also an element of these sorts of opportunities in the multilingual classroom in my second interview. I spoke to Catalin Fogarasi, who is an associate professor and director of the Institute of Languages for Specific Purposes at Semmelweis University in Budapest. Now, this is a specialist medical university that teaches about 7,000 undergraduate and postgraduate students with programs in 7 languages.
Hi, Catalin, and welcome to the Times Higher Education podcast.
Thank you for having me.
How does having so many languages, I didn't realise it was as many as 7, shape the culture and the methods within the university?
Oh, yes, it is a very interesting question. So due to the mix of students in the English language program coming from about 60 different countries, and in the German language program coming from about 3 German-speaking countries, and we also have the Hungarian language training programs, of course. There's a very international and intercultural atmosphere at our university. And while students of the different language programs attend compulsory, mostly medical courses, and also medical terminology and medical Hungarian separately, it is completely different in our elective language courses, such as French and Italian and the other languages, because they provide the epitome of intercultural experience, as in a medical or dental medical or pharmaceutical medical French course, for example, there is an opportunity for all language programs to mingle.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about Magyar, the Hungarian language, which is related to Finnish and Estonian. This is my very superficial description of it. Can you tell us a little bit about the language itself?
Yes, of course. So Hungarian is a language that is not similar to any other Germanic or Slavic or Romance language. They say that we belong to the Finno-Ugric language family, originating from the area between the Baltic Sea and the Ural Mountain in Asia. So we are a bit alone in the middle of Europe and have no relatives here. And there are still some communities of people in the area of the Ural Mountains whose language contains similar words to Hungarian. But unfortunately, we cannot understand Finnish or Estonian, the two languages you have just mentioned belonging to our language family. So the names of numbers in Finnish are kind of similar to Hungarian numbers, and I think the melody of Estonian resembles a bit to the melody of our language, but otherwise we have no similarities with them. And Hungarian language is also unique because it is an agglutinative language, which means that we stick endings, suffixes to word stems. So, for example, prepositions or possessive pronouns are combined with word stems, unfortunately resulting in really long expressions. And this way, so the way our language works is kind of the opposite of most languages. Our students, our international students, speak as native languages, or they speak as second language. But an advantage is that Hungary being a small country, does not have dialects that deviate significantly from the standard language use. So it is a great advantage, I think. And we do not have genders, even in personal pronouns. So we do not differentiate between he and she or they.
Not at all.
Yes, Hungarian is a particularly politically correct language. I'm very proud of this.
That's interesting. I had no idea actually that that any languages existed without any kind of gender. I mean, English obviously doesn't have gendered nouns in the way that French does, for example, but we do have gendered pronouns. Oh, that's so interesting. Now, the reason that I reached out to you is because you wrote an article for us for campus about teaching clinical communication skills to international students. And the article talked about the need to teach students quite quickly to be able to have meaningful, useful diagnostic conversations with patients that would probably be in Hungarian, because the healthcare offered through the university is primarily for Hungarian patients. So students are going to be coming into contact with patients who only spoke Hungarian quite quickly into their clinical experience. So you talked about a way to combine language learning with skills acquisition that is called content and language integrated learning. And I wanted to ask you about this methodology, what it is and how it works in practice.
Oh, yes. Thank you for the question. So I think over the last decade, CLIL, content and language integrated learning, has become common practice in most fields of tertiary education. It means that professional content is acquired in parallel with the language that it used to talk about or to carry out specific professional activities. Because any activity is deeply integrated with the linguistic medium that it takes place in. So if we teach students medical activities such as medical history taking, or physical examination, or instructions on physical examinations, so we teach them how to perform these medical activities in a unified manner, that is, together with the language they should use during these actions. But it not only applies to professional settings. Let me just give you a simple example. So my children are Hungarian and German bilingual.
Mm-hmm.
And as it was mostly their German father who started to play Lego with them, their Lego language is still German, because they are used to playing Lego in German. So every time they start playing Lego, they always do it only in German. So this is the principle we use when teaching international students basic medical skills. So we don't teach all the skills, but mostly the linguistic ones necessary to perform the actions.
Mm.
And the skills themselves, we show them in films, or we use pictures or other audiovisual materials.
This might be a bit of an oversimplification, but is it a bit like when you go to learn travel vocabulary, that you learn specific language for specific situations? So it might be about how to speak about making a travel booking, or the kind of conversation that you might have with someone at the reception of a hotel. And it's not so much about learning the grammar, it's about learning that functional language, so that you can have these communications, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to conjugate a verb in a less usual tense, for example.
Yes, absolutely. So in our view, language learning cannot be based on grammatical rules. So grammar can help us understand the structure of the language, but if we observe children, we can see that they acquire language in a similar way. For example, first they can only repeat phrases they can hear from their parents, and later on they are able to change some elements in longer constructions. And this is the way how vocabulary is taught in our mental lexicon too. I mean, mostly in phrases associated with actions or specific situations, as you have mentioned. Exactly.
I wanted to ask you about the idea of different cultures. You've mentioned in, I think, the English language programs that you would have students from 60 different countries, which is a lot of intercultural mingling. Do you find that this affects the dynamic of language learning? So, for instance, there might be concepts that are difficult to explain in a particular language, or difficult to grasp if you don't have that concept in your own language or culture. And does that affect the way that language is taught in the classroom, do you think?
Yes. Considering the fact that our students come from countries with different medical perspectives, and they are all socialized in the Hungarian medical culture. They, of course, represent a very individual medical role when playing the doctor's role in our simulated doctor-patient interactions in our classes. So they combine their own cultural traditions with the one taught in medical Hungarian. So our students have to get used to greeting and addressing forms, especially when it comes to female names. In Hungary, most elderly women use their husband's name, adding the suffix "me," which means the wife of. So there is absolutely no possibility to directly address such a person without asking for the preference, for example, for their first name. And our students have to get used to these intercultural differences, and we have to explain these to them. So how to ask for the preference of a woman, or how to behave when taking the medical history. And of course, other countries have their own traditions in this respect, and also in how strict the hierarchy is between physicians and patients. So our medical Hungarian classes focus on topics such as politeness, etiquette, and accepted forms of behavior on the part of both the physician and the patient as well. And yes, as for the second part of your question, it is often the case that there is no direct translation for a phenomenon. In these cases, we try to explain the phenomenon itself, for example, this ending "ne" in female names. But in a medical context, I think, so in my experience, medical phenomena exist in our cultures as well. although they use absolutely different expressions to describe them. And in these cases, we use the so-called functional equivalence.
Mm-hmm.
So I've just adopted this term from medical translation studies. It means that we look for an expression, a phrase or a single word that expresses the same content as the word in the source language. The same content means that this word or expression has the same meaning, the same style, and also the same intent as the one in the source language. So this is the way how we can bridge these gaps in the classes.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? On top of the actual content of the lesson. I wanted to ask then if you had any advice for teachers working in a multicultural, multilingual environment.
So I can say that these classes are really fantastic. So I enjoy them very much, and I think that every language instructor can exploit the potential of such an international and intercultural multilingual class. I can say that our students are highly motivated to learn medical Hungarian and also other medical languages used in doctor-patient interactions, because they regard it as a kind of code system that is necessary to gain access to Hungarian patients or to German patients or in any other language, and also to the medical practice in the given culture. We have actually done a survey on our students' motivation, and we found that they really want to learn clinical language rather than general language, because their career motivation is extremely high. And in my view, teaching and practicing medical language should always be based on simulations from the very beginning, simulations in the target language. So this way, intercultural differences become apparent very quickly, and students can get used to playing the physician's role in another language. For example, I personally always ask my students to bring their white coat and stethoscope to the class to examine me as a patient. And it's such an amazing experience that they immediately start to behave and also speak like doctors, regardless of their language level. And after every simulation, I have the opportunity to give them feedback how to adapt their personal or cultural characteristics to the expectations of a patient in the given language. And it is always a very useful and a really amazing experience. So my advice is to openly discuss intercultural topics in the class and to make the classes as practice-oriented as possible.
That sounds like very good advice. And just as a final question, do you think that there is something about being a language learner itself that might make you a better clinical practitioner?
I think so, yes. Because if you are socialized in another culture, in another language, how to perform physical examination, how to take the medical history, I think it fosters your attitude, compassionate attitude to patients, and also your sensitivity to intercultural stimuli, as well as your openness to diversity and different patient backgrounds. And I think you know how it feels to be inferior to another person who speaks a language better than you, and who is more fluent, and who is somehow more familiar with the whole situation, both the cultural and the linguistic situation than you. I think it impacts one's attitude.
I love that answer. I think language learning is incredibly humbling. This has been a really great conversation. So I want to thank you for your time today in explaining a little bit about what you do at Semmelweis and for talking about the cross-cultural communication with us. So thank you, Catalin. Thank you very much.
I thank you so much. It was a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
It's really interesting what Catalin says about the very functional approach to language teaching that they take with their medical students, looking at teaching very specific scenario uses of language and how this is actually how children learn to speak, which seems so obvious now that she has pointed it out, because language is ultimately a tool that we all use. But somehow if you've learnt it in school with all the focus on grammar and so on, it's not always how one would approach it. And of course, as we said before, communication in its broader sense is of course much more than the language itself. So I'm glad she touched on that in explaining how they use simulations to enable them to train these medical students in more nuanced elements of communication, such as manners and ways of addressing people in appropriate terms.
Yeah, all that is cultural, isn't it? It's the way that the hierarchy works. I mean, she mentioned the hierarchy between doctor and patient as well, which is a dynamic I don't think I'd really thought about. I also really enjoyed talking to Catalin about the space that language opens up between people related to that, and that how working in a second language and having an understanding of what it means to try to be a professional in your second language can make people more compassionate and more sensitive listeners, which as trainee doctors, I imagine is an incredibly useful skill.
Yeah, it kind of highlights that this is actually very relevant almost across the board. Probably all of us could benefit from this kind of learning.
Yeah, absolutely.
For anyone interested in reading more advice on bringing cross-cultural dimensions into your teaching and teaching multilingual student cohorts, do head over to campus. We've got lots and lots of resources tackling these topics. That's at www.timeshighereducation.com/campus. Thanks for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.